This is the channel, Ontario Law and the Older Person. Thanks for taking a look. We are going to be addressing just the introduction to elder abuse. Now, obviously, elder abuse is a very stressful subject. I just want to assure people that in this particular video, we're not going to be going into any details about episodes of abuse. We're just going to be talking about what definitions are, what kinds of abuse there are, and a little bit about statutes at the end. The Don't Sue Me warning. The information provided in this video is not legal advice. It is relayed for the purposes of general information. No legal decision should be made based on this material. Any viewer who needs legal advice should contact a lawyer. This is a definition of elder abuse from the World Health Organization website. The link is in the description. So let's see what they say. Overview. The abuse of older people, also known as elder abuse, is a single or repeated act or lack of appropriate action occurring within any relationship where there is an expectation of trust, which causes harm or distress to an older person. This type of violence constitutes a violation of human rights and includes physical, sexual, psychological, and emotional abuse, financial and material abuse, abandonment, neglect, and serious loss of dignity and respect. I just want to point out the bit where they say there's an expectation of trust. That might be a misleading term. It might give the impression that this is a long-term relationship that people are relying on, when we know scam artists can make a phone call sometimes, and that's all it takes to trick someone into giving them money. So, is that a relationship involving trust? So just letting you know, this material is from June 2024. And remember, this is the World Health Organization, so these details might not be specific to Canada, but I think they're still worth looking at. So around 1 in 6 people 60 years and older experience some form of abuse in community settings during the past year. Rates of abuse of older people are high in institutions such as nursing homes and long-term care facilities, with 2 in 3 staff reporting that they have committed abuse in the past year. Now, I want to touch on the bit about how this is happening in institutions. In another video, I pointed out that some studies released by Statistics Canada, their sample left out people in institutions, and they do that again and again. So we're not getting information about what's happening in institutions when we have reports about people's quality of life and health and whatnot that is ignoring those in institutions. It's a problem. Rates of abuse of older people have increased during the COVID-19 pandemic. Abuse of older people can lead to serious physical injuries and long-term psychological consequences. Abuse of older people is predicted to increase as many countries are experiencing rapidly aging populations. The global population of people aged 60 years and older will more than double from 900 million in 2015 to about 2 billion in 2050. So let me go back up to the part about rapidly aging populations. And here's the situation, right? People are living longer, and there's this pressure to keep them living in their own home or a home environment, which is totally natural. No one wants to live in an institution. Yet they continue to ignore what the repercussions are for those who are expected to care for those older people, as those older people live much longer lives than in the past and are increasingly frail. We know that this increases the chance of burnout in caregivers, and we know that when caregivers get burnt out, there are more chances of elder abuse happening. So, we have to think about that all the time when we're talking about abuse towards older people, while at the same time saying we should be relying more on family members to dedicate at some point 24/7 to taking care of this older person. This is from the website of the Government of Canada, an overview of Justice Canada research on senior abuse. And again, we're not going to be going into any explicit detail. We're just introducing you to the kinds of abuse that exist. And this doesn't have a date, but they refer to material from 2022, so should be pretty recent. Different sources will have different descriptions about what kind of abuse exists, and some I think are too short. I like this list. It seems to cover all the bases, but there might be other kinds as well out there that I just haven't found information about yet. But a little bit of a warning, we will be talking about what kinds of abuse exist. Again, we will not be going into any detail involving actual incidents of abuse. Okay, so physical abuse such as assault, financial abuse such as misuse of property, such as fraud, psychological emotional abuse such as threats and harassment, sexual assault. It can also include mental cruelty, irresponsible medication practices such as over medication to keep someone sedate or withholding medication, and sometimes that is to punish someone, but it also might be that this person with this power is actually selling the medication. Humiliation, intimidation, censoring, invasion of privacy, denial of access to visitors, violation of human civil rights, self-neglect. And I looked to the footnote to see a description of why self-neglect would be considered senior abuse, and it doesn't say. I went to the source that this footnote identifies, and it doesn't really explain how self-neglect could be considered abuse. So what do you think about that? I think it's a little bit of a gray area there. Spiritual, religious, or cultural forms of abuse, and that's something to be talked about in a different video, and it's something that happens in things like retirement homes and long-term care facilities. Denial of access to your own spirituality. This is another source. It's a report created by the Canadian Resource Centre for Victims of Crime, and this one is dedicated to elder abuse. It's online. The link is in the description. This document actually has a lot of useful information about this subject. I'm just picking out the bits that I think are relevant to this particular video, but it goes into much greater detail than I am describing in this video. So here we have impacts of crime. Physical and emotional impact. They may recuperate more slowly and life-threatening illnesses can occur. And as we kind of know, if someone is too inactive for a longer period of time, that can result in illnesses developing. Okay, inability to recover financially. If they lose income from a financial or real estate scam, robbery, or burglary, they often struggle even more if they are living on a fixed income. And what can compound that problem is, let's say they want to seek employment in order to supplement their pension. Now we have them dealing with ageism in employment. Will they be able to find that kind of work? Loss of independence. Studies have shown that crime is the catalyst that can bring an end to emotional and financial independence for older adults. Diminished quality of life. Elders may struggle to recover, worrying about the likelihood that it will happen again, and regretting the consequences of the poor decision may drive victims to become reclusive, embarrassed, and distressed and suffer from poor self-confidence. And I'm wondering about this addition of regretting the consequences of the poor decision. Is this a little bit of victim blaming here? Are they talking about people who have fallen for scams, people who have let the wrong person move in with them, people who have given power of attorney to the wrong person? I just think that phrasing is a little off. Okay, vicarious victimization. When a senior has not been a victim but fears being one, they may alter their lifestyle by withdrawing from society, abandoning friends, church, and shopping. They may see the world from a warped perspective, which can happen to elders who are homebound and get all of their news from TV. Also, this is just an observation I've had. Sometimes older people get a little too involved in shows like Forensic Files or maybe Criminal Minds or whatnot, and that gives them a rather dark view of human nature. Just as I said, personal observation. The abuser is typically a family member taking care of the elderly person, staffing personnel from the institution where the elderly person is living, or a spouse. It is not uncommon for the abuser to be a friend or a person whom the elderly is dependent upon, as they are in a position of power and authority. Psychological problems are often present, such as abusive or violent patterns, and psychopathology in the personality of a caregiver who abuses the elderly. Poor adjustment is a contributor as well. Inability to sustain employment, failing relationships, and antisocial behavior are the main signs of poor adjustment. Difficulties coping with stress brought by caring for the older person may also contribute to the abuse. However, no matter the factors involved, abusers make a choice to be abusive. And I don't know how I feel about this. It seems to be suggesting that people who have other personality issues are more likely to be abusers. And I'm just kind of wondering if people with other personality issues, are they going to be the ones taking on responsibility for taking care of an older person in the first place? So this could take a little more looking into. There are many different reasons why abuse might occur, and it is important to note that every instance is unique. Some factors that have been identified include a history of abuse between family members. For example, spousal abuse becomes elder abuse, or abused children become abused caregivers to elderly parents. Dependency. For example, the elderly person becomes dependent on family members, or someone is dependent upon the elderly person for money or housing. So the dependence goes each way, right? It might be the older person who is dependent, but there might be a kind of dependency for the abuser on the elderly person. So that's a interesting dynamic, I think, because usually the person who's being abused is somehow dependent on the abuser. So the fact that it can be on either side to me is very strange and interesting. Stress might be caused by a number of factors such as mental or physical illness, financial pressure, lack of support systems, lack of choice for accommodation for an elderly person, or fear of one's aging. Alcohol or drug use, greed, so lots of financial abuse going on, lack of knowledge about the degree of care and needs of an elderly person. So someone might take on responsibility for taking care of an older person without knowing what they're getting into. And then you can imagine if someone has taken on this responsibility, now there's a bit of a guilt issue where can they say, you know what, this is more than I expected. I can't do this. Lack of respect given to elderly people in a society that values youth, self-reliance, and energy. Lack of professional awareness about the problem of elder abuse so that it might continue undetected. Institutional issues, poor working conditions, work overload, low salaries, inadequate staff training and supervision, and prejudiced attitudes. And in another video, I'm going to talk about this big report that was made in 2016 about the systemic issues in a situation that I'm not going to talk about the details now because it is stressful information, but this report came out in 2016 and nothing was done about it. Frailty. The frailty of an elderly person increases the chance of being abused. Why are elders targeted? Four main factors increase a senior's vulnerability to scams. The four main factors are availability, loneliness, sickness, and prosperity. So availability. Elders are seen as an ideal scam target because they are retired, less mobile, and available for calls. Elders are more reluctant to hang up on telemarketers and are not usually aware of fraudulent schemes, which makes them a more appealing target. Scam artists know they can victimize older adults because their calls, drop-by visits, and claims will be entertained. Loneliness. Elders tend to be isolated from their family, friends, and communities, making them more receptive to those friendly cold callers. Scammers often and this will be continued in the next slide, make themselves seem trustworthy and take advantage of older adults once they have built a relationship with them. And sometimes that relationship is just a phone call. Sickness. Chronic health issues mean that many older adults have difficulty maintaining their property. As some elders may rely on outside sources for help, scammers may take advantage of this situation. This is even more of a problem for those struggling with addiction, depression, and other mental health issues, as these may increase financial risk-taking behavior. Elders struggling with dementia are particularly vulnerable. They struggle to learn new things, concentrate, and make decisions, which makes them seem an easier target for scammers. And some of these scams involving, for example, going to homeowners and tricking them into buying things they don't need, something to be elaborated on in another video. Prosperity. Money is one of the most notable reasons for senior vulnerability. Scammers see elders as a supply of wealth. Elders who manage their life savings, own their homes and property, and have other assets are at higher risk to be scammed. Risk factors for abuse. The senior citizen is socially isolated, especially due to physical disabilities or impairment. The victim suffers from some form of mental impairment, for example, dementia. The senior citizen has substance abuse problems, for example, alcohol or medication. Signs of abuse, for example, forced drug injection, might get it misidentified as signs of voluntary substance use. Alcohol abuse can also impede access to services. Language barriers for the elderly person. Can they communicate with others in their own culture? Are they reliant on their children to communicate with others? So, for example, someone who has immigrated from a country where English is not, or French, are not the primary languages, some never learn the local language, and so that can leave them vulnerable to abuse from their children. Also makes it harder for them to communicate with the kind of professionals who might help them. And then cultural barriers for the elderly person. Being a woman, because women are at a greater risk of being victimized. Why victims might deny abuse. Many cases of elder abuse do not get reported. Moreover, elderly people will often choose to deny abuse if suspected for various reasons, such as the following. And just a little side note, that's a situation in all kinds of areas, all kinds of abuse. You will find that a lot of victims or survivors don't want to talk about it. They don't trust the system. They think there's no point. So it's not just limited to people involving elder abuse. Okay, non-recognition. Victims might not be aware that abuse is abnormal or wrong. In the video Introduction to Ageism, I referred to a couple of charts asking older people if they had experienced ageism. And some of them didn't know. Some answered as if, they weren't sure whether they had experienced ageism, which suggests that maybe they don't know what actions can qualify as ageism. So this might be a similar situation. They just don't understand that this particular behavior is abusive. So victims might not be aware that the abuse is abnormal or wrong. It might be considered part of lifestyle, culture, or relationship. Victims also may not understand the nature of abuse generally. For example, mental confusion, blackouts, misinterpretation of events might attribute to their imagination, forgetfulness in the case of dementia. Elderly men may have traditional values about the sexes, women being the, next slide, weaker sex, which would not allow them to recognize a woman as an abuser or that the treatment they receive is abusive. I saw this disturbing video a few years ago, and it was kind of a test of recognition and interaction and intervention when it comes to an abusive situation. So they had two actors, one male, one female, and so the male actor was like roughing up the woman in a public place. So they were obviously in an argument, and he was like shoving her against some kind of barrier, and people would come in and intervene. When they flipped the script and it was the woman abusing the man doing the exact same thing, a lot of people not only just watched without intervening, but some of them actually laughed, which is horrible. And yeah, this is a barrier that men face. It might be considered harder for them to acknowledge that they have been a victim of abuse because of all societal expectations as to how men should behave. So that's an issue. Control. Victims might perceive the event as under their control, perceive abilities to cope with the abuse, or fear that if the abuse is disclosed, someone else will take control of their life. Rationalization, self-blame, for example. It could have been worse. Or a belief that they are getting what they deserve. For example, if they feel they are not a good parent. Shame, fear of being judged by others, fear of the family being judged by others. Fear of abandonment dependency. If the abuser leaves, who will take care of me? So again, this is a scenario that can arise. One person is dependent on the other. The person who's dependent, they don't have, for example, economic options. Where can they afford to live? Then we have fear of being placed in an institution, fear of retaliation, a belief that police or social workers cannot help them. This was a long time ago, and this is just one police officer, so it might not be relevant today, but I did have a conversation about this issue, what happens when an older person is being abused, and he said unless it's some kind of physical abuse, there's not much they can do about it. But again, that was a good, 15 years ago? Just one police officer, might be different now. A belief that they cannot prove abuse is happening. This is another resource from 2018. Right now, a community strategy to prevent and address elder abuse. The link is in the description. And I'm just going into their discussion about why those who witness abuse don't report it. Why would family members choose not to report abuse? So we have family dynamics. They don't want to get involved. And what reasons might they have for that? Are they afraid of the abuser? Are they afraid of being brought into the spotlight if they are a witness? Are they afraid that if the abuser stops taking care of their elderly relative, that now they'll have to take care of that elderly relative? So, what's the motive there? The older person asks them not to report it. And here we have a bit of a difficult situation. Now, if the older person has full capacity, well, they get to decide whether they stay in that relationship or not. But what if the older person doesn't have capacity anymore? What if they're not in a position to judge what is in their own best interests? Now we have a bit of a challenge. Like, what is the right way to go here? Okay, or lack of information. They don't know who to tell, they don't know what can be done, they don't believe anything can be done. And then we're looking at service providers, and they're not 100% clear on just who is a service provider and whether they are mandatory reporters or not. Now, again, these are adults we're talking about being abused, not children. So do they qualify as mandatory reporters? So that's something that's a little hazy, and I'm not going into the duty to report on certain people because that's too close to actually talking about the law. So these service providers, whoever they might actually be, why are they not reporting abuse that they have witnessed? So they might be afraid of the abuser and of going into the home after the abuse is reported. So what if they are like a personal support worker who goes to the client's home to provide them with care? Do they have a fear that they'll still have to go back to that house? Because remember, this takes some kind of investigation if this is actually happening. So until that investigation is over, will they be afraid to go back and provide those services? They might believe that the police cannot help because the older person would not be physically able to testify in court. They might think nothing can be done because the older person might deny the abuse is happening, and then lack of information. They may believe they have a confidential relationship with their client and cannot tell anyone else about what happens in the client's home. They are unaware that assault, theft, or serious neglect in the family or in a long-term care home is a crime. And I mentioned a report that came out in 2016. We'll be talking in a different video about it. And a lot of it was that the policies people were taught when they worked in these facilities were not accurate when it came to what their legal responsibilities were. So that is an issue. I am going to talk just a little bit about the law regarding elder abuse. So to start with, in the criminal code, there's no section that is dedicated to elder abuse. It's just kind of treated under what other laws are already there. So one relevant section, 215 subsection 1, everyone is under a legal duty, A, as a parent, foster parent, guardian, or head of a family, and what does that mean? To provide necessaries of life for a child under the age of 16 years. B, to provide necessaries of life to their spouse or common law partner. And C, to provide necessaries of life to a person under his charge, and that it is his, but under his charge, that's important. If that person is unable by reason of detention, age, illness, mental disorder, or other cause to withdraw himself from that charge and is unable to provide himself with necessaries of life. So age is an issue, but it's also an issue whether that person is in that first person's charge. So for example, if you have an adult child and their older parent lives independently, then failing to provide the necessaries of life isn't necessarily a crime because that older parent is not under the control of that adult child. So that's an issue we'll get into in another video. We're moving to another section of the criminal code and other sentencing principles. So I've skipped stuff. So what kind of issues are judges considering when, someone's been found guilty of a crime or that they have pled guilty. So when we're making the sentence, what kind of punishment should they get? What are the factors? So this is under section 718.2. A court, meaning a judge, that imposes a sentence shall also take into consideration the following principles. A sentence should be increased or reduced to account for any relevant aggravating or mitigating circumstances relating to the offense or the offender and without limiting the generality of the foregoing. Love that language. I just want to, before I go further, point out the concept of aggravating. A lot of people misunderstand what that means. So, for example, if someone is accused of aggravated assault, we have a lot of people who think, oh, the person was aggravated by the victim for some reason. And so that means it's a lesser sentence. No, it means it's a worse sentence. Aggravating means it's worse. So, for example, assault with your fists is one kind of assault. Assault with a weapon might be considered an aggravated assault because you're using a weapon as you do it. Anyways, just wanted to clear that a little bit up. Okay, including the following: evidence that the offense was motivated by bias, prejudice, or hate based on race, national or ethnic origin, language, color, religion, sex, age, mental or physical disability, sexual orientation, or gender identity or expression, or on any other similar factor. Now, when we look at some of these words, they might remind you of the grounds under the Charter of Rights. You can't discriminate based on these issues. Do you think age really belongs here? Do you think people of ages are part of marginalized groups who have been deprived historically access to the same rights and privileges as those who are not marginalized? What do you think of having age in that section? I decided to look at other jurisdictions. So this is from British Columbia, the Adult Guardianship Act. And in their definitions, in this act, abuse means the deliberate mistreatment of an adult that causes the adult A, physical, mental, or emotional harm, or B, damage or loss in respect of the adult's financial affairs, and includes intimidation, humiliation, physical assault, sexual assault, over medication, withholding needed medication, censoring mail. Interesting. Might be a form of social isolation there. Invasion or denial of privacy or denial of access to visitors. And so in this case, this is specific to abuse against older people. And as I mentioned, on the criminal code level, we don't have that. And then from the other end of Canada, this is from Newfoundland, the Adult Protection Act 2021. And looking at the definition here, Section 2, in this act, abuse means the deliberate mistreatment of an adult that causes or is reasonably likely within a short period of time to cause the adult serious physical, psychological, or emotional harm or substantial damage to or substantial loss of real or personal property, including financial assets, and includes intimidation, humiliation, and sexual assault. And the thing is, with these definitions, different judges are working with different statutes, and that can have an impact on the results, right? So you might get very different results involving elder abuse in different parts of the country. I did check the territories, and like a lot of other places, they don't have a law specific to elder abuse. They kind of address elder abuse through sections of other laws. Anyways, that's the end of this video. Thank you for getting to the end of it, and have a great day.